Good morning. Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for being with us. Today should be an interesting day, and I say that because the ideas that we're coming and are still coming with regard to today's message, today's topic, are all over the place, all over the place. And it's kind of interesting because the idea that came to me was focus, keep thine eye single was kind of the start of it. And then I got scattered. The ideas got scattered. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Reminds me of what Pema Chodron said. We talked about it a few weeks ago, that as human beings, we have a tendency in our human experience, we have a tendency to say one thing, say we want one thing, and then go and behave in a manner that is exactly the opposite of what we said we wanted. She was writing a book on peace, and it created a great deal of stress in her life. And she was able to chuckle at it, able to laugh at it and say, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So today, hopefully, we're eventually going to get back to clarity, single-mindedness, focused attention. But I think we have to wander a little bit before we get there. We're going to have to kind of sneak up on it a little bit, because some things are just so obvious that we say them and we think we understand them. Oh yes, of course, We nod our heads knowingly, but we may not entirely have a grasp on it. We need to work our way up to it. So it's kind of like learning to ride a two-wheel bicycle. Typically, you start with training wheels. Now, what's interesting is that when we were children and we're learning to ride a bicycle with training wheels, it's not behaving as a bicycle because it's got these two extra wheels in the back that are propping us up, and they are making the bicycle behave in a manner that is different than when we take the training wheels off. So you take the training wheels off the bike, and suddenly the child is going through this whole new learning experience because now suddenly for the first time they are truly experiencing what it's like to negotiate the world on just two wheels. So a lot of our learning is like that. A lot of our growth is like that. We start out and we need aids, and we need these things to kind of help us, to help us where we are. I think that's a key takeaway. Is we have to start where we are. We can't start where we think we are, or we wish we were, or we pretend to be. We have to honestly reflect and say, well, where am I? Where am I? And that's where we have to start. So Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, once said that what people say and what people do and what people say they do are three entirely different things. And that's part of the human experience. We all kind of want to start much further down the road than we are, because that's where we say we are. But the things that we do tell us where we really are. And there's no judgment there. There's no complaining. We can't say, oh well, I'm going to pick on myself because I'm not where I think I am. My behavior doesn't agree with where I think I am. So that's just part of the experience. That's just part of the experience. And I think it's a wonderful part of the experience because our vision should always be out and ahead of our actions. We should always be seeing the next horizon in our minds. We should always be anticipating and moving forward towards something greater, something bigger. What does the poet say? If something our reach cannot exceed our grasp, then what's the heaven for? Our mind goes before us. Our thoughts go before us. Our awareness goes before us. So think of what we as human beings are. Think of how unique that ability is. We can travel in time, we can travel in space, and without ever leaving our home. We can anticipate, for example, a trip to Europe, let's say. And suddenly our mind is way ahead of us. Our mind is there, checking off all the things we have to do. Do we have our passport? Do we need to have any shots before we go? How are we going to get local currency? Our mind is kind of anticipating. It's thinking of all the different cities, all of the different places. What are the things that we want to experience when we're there? The canals, the cathedrals, the art museums. And we've never left home. We're still sitting at home. So our behavior is that we're here, but our mind is already way out there in front of us. That's part of the experience. We just need to accept that that's part of the experience. And that's part of the experience with our spiritual growth as well. But we can get ourselves into trouble if we never make that appraisal and say, well, this is where my behavior is. These are the things that I'm doing. And when I am truly living my life as I would like to be, I would be doing different things. I would be spending more time, for example, in my spiritual practice, in service, in love, different things. But we get caught up in the things of the world. We get caught up in where we are today. So we, as human beings, if you stop and think about what is it that kind of differentiates us from what we know so far about the rest of creation, and certainly we don't know all that there is about the rest of creation, but what do we know so far? Desmond Morris, back, I guess it was the 60s or maybe the 70s, Desmond Morris, who was a zoologist, wrote a famous book called The Naked Ape. And he said, suppose you were a visitor from outer space, and you came to Earth, and you were just observing all of the different forms of life on Earth, and you had no inclination that human beings were anything other than part of life on Earth. And you compare them, compare the human beings to other creatures, and how would you categorize humans? How would you classify humans? And he says, well, you would probably classify human beings as some type of a hairless ape, a naked ape. But then when you go to compare the behaviors, the structures of society and all of those things between the naked ape and the other apes, you would find that there's differences. There's differences in behavior. So if we look at ourselves, if we look at what is it about humanity, what is it about being human, what can we do that, as far as we know, other species cannot or do not? And it's this power of our thoughts, this power of mind, if we want to call it mind, or consciousness, if we want to call it consciousness, or thinking, if we want to call it thinking. But we can choose. We can choose what to think. We can choose what to believe. We can direct our mind to go places that we've never been before. Surely we can do research and we can gather information. But we can explore. We can explore totally with this thing that we call our mind, our consciousness. We can direct it. Ernest Holmes tells us that one of the greatest discoveries of mankind is when we realized that we were thinkers. And I think that's an interesting observation, an interesting first step. We are thinkers. And the delineation there is we are not our thoughts. See, we are not our thoughts. As we are learning and as we are growing and as we are developing and as we are children, we typically don't make that differentiation. There's a thought and we think it's our thought. There's an emotion and we think it's our emotion. And we have to act and react on them because they're ours. I'm sad and I need to behave as if I'm sad. I'm happy and I need to behave as if I'm happy. But as we grow spiritually, we start to learn, to detach from the thought, to detach from the emotion, to observe the thought, to observe the emotion. And suddenly I am not the thought. And maybe I'm not even the thinker of the thought, but maybe I'm the one observing the thought. So we have this ability to choose. Now, we don't always exercise that ability of choice or of awareness, but we have the ability to become aware of the activity of thoughts in our consciousness, and we can choose deliberately which ones we wish to identify with, which ones we want to act upon, which ones we want to ignore. So while Desmond Morris might say human beings from the outside, when we look at them, they look just like an ape, but they're naked. They have no fur. We might say from the inside, from the spiritual side, we have the ability to control our consciousness. Yet if we observe our own behavior, if we observe the behavior of the world around us, we find that there's very, very little of this discretion taking place, you know. I mean, you've all been on Facebook, and you know you've got that friend that no matter what somebody says, they feel the need to comment on it, you know, particularly if it's political and it's something they don't like. They have to respond. They just can't help themselves. They have to do something. And yet that's common in our society. You'll hear people all the time say, well, I didn't have any choice, or you know, this is what a reasonable person would do, and I had to act, I had to react that way. There was nothing else to do, you know. And I think we have to push back on that. As we grow, we have to push back on that and say, really? Maybe there's always a choice. Maybe there's always a choice. But for us, the difficulty is that things happen so quickly. There's so many things going on all at the same time that we don't always exercise that choice. We're not always aware. We're busy reacting and responding, and we're not always aware. I was reading a book recently. I read it a couple of times, and it's about motorcycle racing. It's about an instructional course to teach motorcycle riders how to properly ride, so they can take the corners much better than most riders can. The most common accident for a motorcycle rider where there's no other vehicles involved is when the motorcycle rider runs off the road, and a failure to negotiate a turn. They're not practiced enough. They go to get in a turn, they're going in a little bit they think they're going a little bit too fast, and they wind up crashing. So this gentleman put together this course. It's very interesting the way that he put it together. And he said, he asked his students to consider that we all have a limited amount of attention units. And this is true for all of us. We can't take in everything that's going on around us. We only select a little part. We can't even see most, you know, our eyes don't respond to a great portion of the radio frequency spectrum. We can only see a part of it. We don't hear all of the noise that there is to hear. And we tend to take in things that we expect to see. And this is why you'll hear me say, what do you expect? What do you accept as normal? What are you expecting? Because that's what you're going to see. That's what you're going to get. So this gentleman said, if you want to think about the act of riding the motorcycle, you have to consider the fact that you only have a certain number of attention units that you can spend. It's like money. You only have a certain amount of attention that you have to spend. And you need to use that wisely. You need to conserve that. You don't need to waste your attention on things that you should not be wasting your attention on. And then he went on to explain that when the riders are coming into a corner and they haven't set it up properly, they start to think they're going too fast. He says then what happens is he called them survival reflexes. Survival reflexes start to kick in. So what happens is the riders tend to do things that seem perfectly reasonable with regard to everything that they've ever learned in the past. But these behaviors are in fact completely the opposite of what they need to do. So just one example, without giving you a total course on how to ride a motorcycle, is that if a rider is going into the corner, making a turn, and this is a high-speed turn on a racetrack or maybe on a windy mountain road, they're going into the turn, and a motorcycle turns by leaning over on the side of its tires. When you're leaning on the side of the tires, imagine a cone, like an ice cream cone shape, on the road, and it's going, and you can understand then how the wheel will turn. So it needs to be leaned over in order to turn, and the further it leans over, the sharper the turn. And of course there's a balance there, because you have to keep power on. If you're leaned way over and you suddenly release power, you can fall down. So what tends to happen is the rider will be going into the turn, and the rider starts to think, oh my goodness, I'm not going to make it around this turn. It's too sharp. And what they tend to do is they want to slow down. And when they try to slow down, they'll release a little bit of the gas, and as soon as they do, the bike tries to come back up a little bit, and that makes them go wider, and they run off the turn. Things like that. So the point is that they're coming into the turn, and they haven't done things properly on the way in, and suddenly all of their attention units, all of their capital that they have to spend is now focused on not making the turn. So the bike starts to straighten up a little bit, and they look right at the side of the road where they don't want to go, and they go right to it. Target fixation, they call that, target fixation. So what has happened is all of the attention has gone from where it should have been, which was properly setting up and executing in the first place. It has gone to where they didn't want to go. Their survival instinct, or survival reaction, took them straight off the road. Another example is when I was learning how to fly. A common accident in student pilots is when they're making the final turn to land at the airport. They're coming in way too low, and they don't want to see the ground that close. So what they want to do is pull back up on the stick, which kind of raises the nose a little bit and gives you a much prettier picture. It looks like you're much higher than you are, but you're not. And of course, when you do that, the nose gets up too high, the wings can't make lift, and the plane stalls. The wing stalls, which means the wing isn't making lift. The motor doesn't stall, the wings stall. And the way to recover that is to push forward on the stick and point your nose straight down towards the ground, which nobody wants to do because you're already, like 200 feet off the ground. You don't want to do that. But that's what you have to do. That's what you have to do in order to recover. And we're trained to do that. Pilots, your instructors make sure you know how to do it. Of course, you do it up at a safe altitude, but it's kind of drilled into you. But the survival reaction is come back on the stick, and when you come back even further, you stall the wing even more, and then the plane stalls and spins and crashes. So if we are not consciously aware, of what we are thinking and what we are choosing, What tends to happen to us in life, in our daily life, is we get caught up reacting and responding. We get caught up in the busyness of life. We get caught up in the doing and that making it happen and all of these other things. And all of those things, from a spiritual perspective, all of those things are just like the survival reactions in that we're doing the wrong things. We're doing the things wrong. We're doing the opposite of what we ought to be doing. We have the ability to become aware of what we're thinking, but we don't use it. And it's particularly when we're caught up in a survival situation, a react and respond situation, you know. And I'm not talking about life, necessarily life or death, but you know, we've all had those days where you go to work and then everything just falls apart, you know, and you spend the entire day, you're on the phone, you're on the email, you're in meetings, you're just running here, there, and everywhere, and all you're trying to do is run around and kind of plug leaks wherever the leaks might be. And then you go home at night and go, whew, and then you know you got to get up the next day and go do it all over again. So there's no planning going on. There's no thinking going on. There's no awareness going on. There's just, I'm caught up in a great ball of reaction. And when I'm doing that, I'm not living life as a spiritual being. I'm not living life with my spiritual awareness. And that's what I'm talking about, spiritual awareness. Okay? Can we be aware? Can we be aware of what we are thinking? Can we be aware of different ways of thinking? Can we be aware of the power and the presence that is right here where we are, that we ignore, that, you know, that we completely ignore? I met a man one time in the airport in Toronto. In Toronto it was. And they have a customs clearing area there. So if you're going to the United States, you arrive early for your flight, but you clear customs and immigration. You clear U.S. customs and immigration right there in Canada, and then you go into the secure area. And they've got a lounge, and they've got restaurants and things like that. But you wait for your plane there, so that way you just fly directly into the States. You don't have to clear customs and immigration again. And I met a man there. We were talking and just started a conversation. And his job, he worked for a big mining company up in Canada, and his job was kind of like troubleshooter. If something wasn't going well on a job, his job was to go out and figure out what was wrong and fix it, which my job was very similar to the company I work for. So we were swapping war stories. And he said that one time they were putting a mine in a country in Asia, and they were falling way behind schedule, and nobody could figure out why. Nobody could figure out why they were behind schedule. So his boss came and got him and said, go over there, figure out what's going on, straighten it out for us. So he did. He flew over to the airport and got on a chartered helicopter that was going to fly him out to the mining construction site where they were trying to build this mine, but they weren't making much progress. And he says as they got closer and closer to the mountaintop or hill where the mining operation was going to be, you see, he looked down and he could see all of these bulldozers and road grading equipment and heavy machinery that the mining company had flown over. And it was just sitting there in the jungle. Nobody was using it. And he says when he got up closer to the head of the road, they had to build a road into the construction site. He says there were people riding elephants and they were pushing the trees down. That was their culture. That was the way that construction was done. That was what was the normal, natural, acceptable way in that society for the work to get done. And here these people had at their disposal a tremendous amount of horsepower in the form of diesel engines, in the forms of bulldozers and road graders and everything else. And they weren't using it. They weren't using it because of their worldview. They weren't using it because of what they thought. They weren't bad people. They weren't ignorant people. These were people who were raised to believe that this is the way it ought to be. This is the way that things ought to be done. And as you and I go through life, we get stuck in the old ways. We get stuck in the old patterns. We get stuck in believing that this is the way that things ought to be done, and we don't use the tremendous resources that are available to our spiritual nature, available to us through our spiritual nature. Excuse me. As we go through life, living life as if we were just human, only human. You hear that, we're only human. Well, that's not true. That's not true. So we're told in the New Testament, we're told a couple things that we want to kind of just keep in mind as we go through the rest of this morning here. So Jesus is at the well, and he says to the woman that the Father, which was his term for God, the Spirit, said the Father is Spirit and must be worshipped in spirit. You have to think of spiritual things spiritually. We're told that you can't put new wine into old skins. What that means to me is that some ideas are so revolutionary that you can't explain them and entertain them and consider them with your old thought patterns. They just blow them away. They're so far beyond everything that you've ever known that there's no sense trying to say, oh, well, that's like this, because it's not like this. There's nothing like that. It's ineffable. It's ineffable. Right? And we're told in another place that there comes time where you have to stop patching the old house, stop repairing the old house, and you have to clean everything, scrape it down to the foundation, and start building anew. Again, some ideas are so radical that you can't just keep tweaking and updating your mental concept of the world, that concept of the world that tells you to do things in the old way when you've got all of this tremendous power and resources available to help you. You must learn to discern spiritually spiritual things. So this then brings us to the point of, well, how do we do that? How do we do that? And we need training wheels. We need training wheels. So this is how we get to the title we finally arrived at, which is look both ways and then use your third eye. Look both ways and then use your third eye. So the first way, when we're given an opportunity to do something, the first way that we're going to look at it is usually the way that we have always looked at it. Well, this is the way that we've done it in the past. This is the way that my parents did it. This is the way that my society does it. You know, we're gonna get on the elephant and start pushing trees down, because that's the way trees get moved in our culture, in our society. So that's the first way that we look at things. And what we have to do is we have to stop ourselves, so we have to back up just a little bit and say, okay, well, that's one way. Rather than just jumping in and starting to take action because this is the way it's always been done, we have to stop and ask ourselves, well, is there another way? What might another way be? Now, in some of the, I think it's Lakota Sioux, in some of the Native American traditions, there's a phenomenon called the contraries. And these are people who, for their spiritual growth, did everything exactly the opposite. Everything exactly the opposite of the way that they had been doing it. So normally you would ride a horse facing forward. They would ride a horse facing backwards. You know, normally if you wanted to go right, you'd turn right. They would go left. They, instead of washing themselves with water, they would wash themselves with dirt, and then they would dry themselves with water. So they would do everything just the opposite. And we look at that and we say, well, isn't that amusing? You know, isn't that kind of interesting? And what that does, what I believe it does, is it forces us to see another way. It forces us to look at something another way, to break out of the old thought patterns, to break out of the old ruts, if we want to call them that, to deliberately force ourselves to think a different way. One of the things that we would do when we were trying to facilitate change in an organization is basically it came down to we had to teach people to ask different questions. That was it. And that's the secret of your growth, is you have to learn to stop and think and ask different questions. So what we would do is we would coach the executive, whoever the executive was, who was the head of the department, that when they were holding their monthly reviews and their staffers came in and said, well, this is the issue that we're working on and here's the solution that we came up with. We simply taught the boss to ask, well, is that the first right answer that you came up with? And they would say, yeah, well, you know, we had this problem, we analyzed it, and that's the answer. And the boss would say, I want you to go back and come and tell me the second right answer that you come up with. And this kind of blew people away because they're so used to saying, this is the problem, this is the solution, here's what we're going to do, boom. And it forced them to go back and explore alternatives. So they would come back the next month and they would say, this is the second right answer. We went and dug a little bit deeper. This is the second right answer we came up with. And usually what we found is when they first started doing this, the second right answer that they would give was really not the second right answer. They would give us something that was obviously a wrong answer so that they could justify their first right answer. And we'd have to send them back again and say, no, find another. And eventually what happened is they started to dig deeper and they would come back and they would say, oh, you know what? We found another answer that's even better than our first right answer. So this is what I consider to be like kind of the contrary way in decision making in business. You know, don't do it the old way. Force yourself to look and find another solution. So that's looking the other way. Look both ways. Okay? What is the normal way of doing it? What is the complete opposite? Start with an extreme. What is the complete opposite of that normal, natural way? How might somebody else do this? And then kind of come back and look for a middle ground, maybe another way, another right answer. And all that is doing is that is your training wheels that is forcing you to become a conscious chooser, forcing you to become aware of your thought process, forcing you to say, I don't have to accept the first thing that comes to my mind. I don't have to do it that way because we've always done it that way. I have a choice. I am more than a naked ape. I have the ability to become aware of what I am aware of and to choose what I will believe, to choose what I will decide. And I exercise that choice. So once we've kind of learned at the human level, we've learned that we can train ourselves to think differently and to make different choices. Well, now that's the next step is the third eye. The third eye. So what do I mean by the third eye? And of course, in the 7 chakra systems of the East, the third eye is the one right in the middle of the forehead, right between the other 2 eyes. And it is considered to be the center of intuition. As spiritual beings, we have access to information and to ideas and to knowledge that we don't normally tap into. Because like the motorcycle rider who's in the turn, who is suddenly caught in a survival reaction and doing the wrong thing, we are caught up in our belief that our first right answer was the thing we ought to do, and we're busy executing it. So we tend not to turn and stop and at least explore our intuition. And if you read a little bit about Tesla, Tesla's idea of invention was revelation. The concepts are already there, the ideas were already there, and somehow he became available to them. Somehow he opened himself up. And he saw these things as an already accomplished fact. He saw them as done. And tried to copy down what he had seen. And people say, well, you know, that was Tesla. That's all of us. That's all of us. Einstein said that, his greatest breakthroughs didn't come through logic and reason. They came through imagination. They came from putting his mind out there and seeing something different. Perhaps seeing what was already there, as Tesla did. In fact, it just popped into my head. I think there's a quote that at one point somebody asked Einstein, what is it like to have the greatest mind in the world? And Einstein said, I don't know, you're going to have to go ask Tesla. There is within us the ability to tap into omniscience, all the knowledge that is there. And that gives us a third way of looking, a spiritual way of looking. So you might stop whatever it is that you're trying to solve, a problem that you're trying to solve, an opportunity you're trying to pursue, and you might stop and close your eyes and say, what is the spiritual view of this? What is the spiritual way of looking at this? How would God see this? How would the divine see this? What other possibilities are there? And this takes practice. This is why I'm talking about focused attention. In our human lives, we are so scattered, we are so distracted, we are here, we are there, we are everywhere. We've got all of these sensory inputs that are coming to us constantly, demanding our attention. The TVs, the radios, everything that's going on. You get in your car and you're trying to drive down the road, you turn the radio on, all of a sudden you hear sirens. And you think, oh my goodness, there's a fire truck behind me. You turn the radio off so you can hear the fire truck and the sirens go away. The producer of the radio commercial put sirens in there to force you to pay attention. So very deliberately, the world that we live in very deliberately is screaming at you. Pay attention to me, pay attention to me. You go on the internet and the websites are flashing boxes at you. And music starts playing, you don't know where the music's coming from. That's the way of the world. That is the world fighting for your attention units. And if you spend all of your capital, if you spend all of your attention, if you allow it to be wasted in distractions, if you allow other things to take your attention, you won't have any left to focus on the important things, the spiritual things. So it requires a discipline. And by discipline, I mean doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done. It requires a discipline of bringing ourselves deliberately into a practice of at times sitting and listening. And this doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be where you take 45 minutes of your schedule and you sit in your office and you light incense and close your eyes because you're thinking of greater ideas. But if you have a job where you can do that, that's great. It can be just a few minutes, just a few minutes to acknowledge there's another way, there's another solution, there's another possibility here, and I'm going to listen to it. There was a time in my career where I was creating a lot of things, training interventions, things like that. And I used to just sit in my office and stare at the whiteboard. And I would see different drawings in my head. I would see different drawings come up on the whiteboard. And I would think those through. I would send my mind ahead of me and I would think those through, And I'd say, oh, there's another way. And I would sit and I would wait. And I would sit and I would wait for inspiration. And I would sit and I would wait. And then eventually, sometimes it would take an hour, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. A totally different approach would come to me, a totally different way. And it was then that I would get up and I would take the marker and I would start drawing on the board. And my door was open to my office and my colleagues would be walking down the hall and they would see me sitting there just staring at the whiteboard. And they didn't understand it. They didn't understand. You're not doing anything. You're just sitting there looking at the wall. And I would have to tell them, I'm thinking, it's okay. They were so used to doing so used to being in action, so used to being on the phone and making things happen, that they would make fun of somebody who could just sit and think. But it's important that we do that. It is important that we take the time to do that, that we start to break out of the old habits, the old ways of doing things. And even if we can only take a minute, if we can take 5 minutes, take 5 minutes. If you're in an office where you can go outside, sometimes they have benches outside where you can go take a break. Open yourself up. Remember, you are a spiritual being. The divine mind already knows all that is to be known. Omnipresence is right where we are. And we now open ourselves up and are receiving new and greater ideas. New and greater ideas. So as we start to do that, we start to learn. We start to experience. We learn through experience, not just through rhetoric or knowledge. We start to learn through experience that, my God, yes, we are more than this bag of bones and the chemical reactions that take place in the gray matter of the brain. And we are spiritual beings. And it is that point that we let the training wheels go. It is that point that the training wheels come off. And we wobble a little bit because, because the training wheels, kind of like the bicycle, they gave us an experience that wasn't real. But at some point we have to let go. And we have to step into being more comfortable with our spirituality, being more familiar with our spirituality. And then what happens is we come to a realization that the most important thing in our lives, the most important thing we can ever do or accomplish or experience is discovering more of our spiritual nature. Now it's difficult because the world tells us it's how busy you are out here and how much stuff you do out here and how much money you make out here and how big the buildings are that you build out here and how many people report to you and all those other things that we do. And all of that's nice. But the most important thing that we will ever experience is our own spirituality, the presence of the divine within. And once we learn that that is something that we have to make time for, we have to deliberately make time for, then we understand that we have to be consistent. We have to maintain focus. It's like starting a fire with a magnifying glass. All of the power of the sun is available to be focused through that lens, to be put down on the kindling and start our fire for us. But two things are required. We have to have focus, and we have to sustain that focus. If we move the magnifying glass all over, in and out, up and down, all around, nothing will ever happen. What is the most important thing in our lives? How much time are we spending with it? Are we doing so consistently? I know many of you have read Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich, and in that book he gives the example of Charles Schwab. When Charles Schwab started United Steel and they bought out Carnegie and made Carnegie the richest man in the world at that time. And they made this big conglomerate of steel companies. And Schwab was trying to get everybody organized. He felt there was a way that he could improve the efficiency of the organization. And he brought in a consultant, and he just said to the consultant, he says, I want you to go around and see how the different heads of the different companies that are in this corporation, how they do things. And I want you to come up with a suggestion that will help me get them to be more efficient and more effective. So the man did. He went around and he he sat and he watched these people work for a day or so, and he came back to Schwab and he said, here's my suggestion. He says, have every one of them make a list in the morning of the top 3 things that needs to be done that day. No more. If they make the list too long, they'll never get everything done. But just the top 3 things. And have them put them in priority order. Put the most important thing first. Next most important thing, and so on. And then have them work on that most important thing until it's complete. And then move to the next. Until it's complete. And then move to the next. And that was the entire idea that this consultant gave to Schwab. And Schwab said, well, okay. He said, how much do I owe you? And the fellow said, well, he says, try out the idea for a couple of weeks, and then you decide how much it's worth to you. I'll leave myself completely at your mercy. If you think it's worth something, you send me a check. If you don't think it's worth anything, you don't. And after a couple of weeks, Schwab sent the man a check for, I think it was $20,000, which in the early 1900s was a ton of money. Very simple. Very simple. What is the most important thing? And are you doing it? And are you staying with it? Are you staying with it? And this, of course, leads to the biblical quote, keep thine eye single. Keep thine eye single. There's only God. There's only God. The ways of the world are fun and they're interesting and they can keep us busy and all of those things. But what's the most important thing? I think as I started, we said that human beings, as far as we know, are the only creatures capable of observing our own thoughts. That's the uniqueness. But we don't spend a lot of time doing that. Our spiritual growth requires us to do so. We can lean into that growth with some training wheels. We can force ourselves to look both ways. This is the way I usually do it. What's another way? What's the opposite way? What's a contrary way? What's the next best idea? That's a technique that we use. It's our training wheels that force us. Then we can say, but what is the spiritual way? We can look with our third eye. What is the spiritual way? And as we begin to have more and more experience of the spiritual, then we can say to ourselves, that's the most important thing. That's what I need to be giving my time to. I'm not going to put new wine into old skins. I'm not going to try to patch up the old consciousness and the old ideas anymore. From that point on, we live our lives as the spiritual beings that we truly are. Look both ways. Look with your third eye, and then keep your eye single. And so it is.